with him, and she appeared to be very happy. But there was something about him that I just didn't quite like.
I feared my father. Little things would set him off.
He needed control.
My sister and I thought this sort of behavior was normal.
She wasn't his wife. She was a possession. And he was not going to let anybody or anything take his possession away from him.
This was so cruel.
My sister Jenny and I were very, very close when we were younger. We were about 1.5 years apart. When we were going to elementary school, we would strap on our skates, and our dog Freckles, he was a big Dalmatian dog, big fat one. He would pull us on the sidewalks of the school, and that was one of my fondest memories of her. We were always together. We were very, very tight. When I was 11 and my sister was 9.5, my mom separated from my dad and we moved from California to Maryland. I was not getting along with my mom all that well. And so I moved back to California to live with my dad. My sister and I would keep in contact, phone calls and letters. That's when she met Michael. She was very young, she wasn't but 14 years old or so. The first time I met Michael, I have to say, there was something about him inside that I just didn't quite like, and I could never put my finger on it. He had an immaturity about him, being very boastful. When you meet these people that are just all into themselves, like they're the greatest person in the world and the entire world revolves around them, that was Michael. But I believe that he filled a hole in her life that she was really yearning for. She was in love with him and she appeared to be very happy. Jenny eloped with Michael when she was about 15, 16 years old. She had told me that she was pregnant, and my mom was definitely not happy with the situation, but she accepted the situation. And at that point, Jenny went to live with his parents down in Virginia. I met his dad a couple times. He was very gruff. He was a very stern father. And his mother, she was very dutiful, making sure that the dinner's on the table every night, making sure that everything's clean, the dishes are washed. Jenny seemed right at home. She built a life with him. They would go camping, they would go places together. They were a young couple, striking out against the world. And it at least appeared from the outside that they were a happy couple. About 10 years later, Melissa came along. And now with 2 children, the financial strain on the family, of course, it grows.
My mom worked a lot of odd jobs. She worked at a pizza place, she worked at a Mexican restaurant, and she ended up following in my grandmother's footsteps, and she worked in hospice care and took care of people.
She kept her nose to the grindstone. She worked on her schooling and she got her RN license. She was very much into the nursing field. Michael never held down a job for very long. Every time I talked to my sister, she was telling me that, oh yeah, Michael got fired from another job or he quit this job. And so my sister had to financially support the family, and it was a constant struggle for her.
She would also do as many odd jobs as she could. She would do people's taxes, and she sold Avon to try to keep money coming into the house. My father retired very young. He worked as a maintenance man at a popular hotel chain, and he said he dropped a bird bath on his foot. I never saw him limping or anything, but that's the reason he said he was retiring. After my father retired, he really became a recluse. He would just hide in his garage and just scroll eBay. He would buy all these collectible Tupperwares from the 70s. He would buy Beatles bobbleheads and records, and he would never listen to them. He would never use these things. He had multiple guitars and this giant firearm collection. He just wouldn't share a common space at all with anyone. He wouldn't even eat dinner at the same time as us. He would just look at eBay all day, all night. That's all he did.
He just spent. It was like he was just buying just to buy. I started to see that maybe it was because he needed control over it. As a child with his father, he was actually controlled. However, the spending was something where he was in control. He hadn't worked in years. He wasn't supporting the family like a mature man and husband should do. You take away the self-worth of a person, it's hard to be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And I believe because of that controlling nature that was placed upon him, he ended up doing the same because that's what he felt comfortable with. That was his life. My husband and I decided that we'd had enough of California, and so we decided to move back to Maryland. And so my sister Jenny offered to go ahead and let us move in. In that month that I was there, I would hear the arguments. I would hear mainly Michael yelling at her, and my sister would be just trying to appease him. And I witnessed that on many, many occasions, pretty much almost on a nightly basis. Any respect that I really had for Michael dissipated very quickly at that point. I'll just be honest with you, I was thinking that Michael was a bum.
I never really saw the love between my parents. He didn't show her kindness or anything. He just continued to do nothing but abuse her. My father would do all of these disrespectful things. He would shove her against the wall or hip check her and call her the N-word. And he would belittle her any chance he got.
Her and I discussed the relationship just very briefly, but she really didn't want to talk about it. I knew my sister was in trouble, but I really didn't know how bad things were.
I was 4 years old. And I remember chaotic screaming. He took the back of my sister's neck and slammed her against the bed frame in our room. My mother was sitting on the stairs, holding my sister's head together. All I remember was her saying, "It's okay, honey, just stay calm, while we waited for the EMTs. I don't know if my mom didn't report him to the police because she was scared that we would end up on the street, or she really thought that all relationships were this way. My sister and I didn't know anything else, so of course we thought this sort of behavior was normal. When my sister turned 16, she got married and moved out. I feared my father. I remember I climbed onto the roof of our home because he was afraid of heights and I knew he wouldn't follow me. Little things would set him off. Would always tense up and you could never tell what he was thinking. And then he would just go for you. The first time my father threw me out of the house, I was 14 years old and it was snowing. It became a rather common occurrence for him to throw me out. It was always over something stupid. I would have to go find a couch or a friend to stay with. Really around the age of 15 on, I was no longer in the home. I would always ask my mother, why do you let this happen to me? And she would go, oh, honey, I can only control myself. We just lived in fear and just tiptoed and walked on eggshells, and he just did whatever he wanted.
Jenny would never really open up to me. She may have been embarrassed to say that, hey, you know, things aren't hunky-dory here in paradise anymore. I, to this day, do not really know exactly why she stayed with him. I believe that she didn't want to throw away what she had built with her family. My mom was living in Edgewater, Maryland. She had been in a car accident and she'd been having some really bad trouble with her ankle. And so my sister said, well, I'm going to go ahead and bring her to my home here in Virginia. She put her in a spare room that they had, but then they decided that they would do an addition onto the home with a living room and a room for my mom to live in, her own bathroom. My mom got right around $150,000 for the sale of her house, and $72,000 went into the remodel of the home. My mom would write me fairly often. She asked me point blank, why are they still charging me $2,500 a month to live here when I paid for doing this addition for my own room? At that point, I felt very helpless. This should not be. Why is she getting charged any money? You know, other than maybe food. And Jenny's reply back to me was that, I know, Susie, I know. I realized that she was completely powerless to do anything. I could tell she felt horrible about it, but she had no choice.
My father's spending was out of control. The money had to come from somewhere. I know they were refinancing multiple times as well, just to try to keep it going. My mom just didn't have a say in that house at all.
My mom was now being taken advantage of. My sister, by far, had been being taken advantage of. She needed to get away. My mom needed to get away, but there was no place for either of them to go. It's a horrible feeling knowing that somebody is in a situation that they can't get out of and you can't help them.
I told her, Mom, this isn't normal. Mom, he's abusing you. And I was giving her examples. And that's when she really kind of started to slowly think of the idea of trying to escape.
All of a sudden, out of the blue, get a phone call from Michael saying, yeah, Jenny left me. Do you know where she is? If I'd known what the end result would have been, I certainly would have done something.
The first time my mom thought about leaving was in 2014. She had realized that she was in a loveless marriage, and she had started to see how bad the abuse really was. One day she left work. She didn't tell him that she had put in her 2 weeks' notice, and she drove straight from her job to my house. And I was thrilled.
I had no idea she had even left him. But I received a phone call from Michael, and he was very, very upset. And he was imploring me if I knew where Jenny was. He was very emphatic. He wanted to know where she was. I immediately called my sister. She told me that he had taken a gun and he had pointed it to her head. And he had told her, if you ever leave me, I will kill you.
That was the turning point.
When she told me that, I knew who he was. And I knew what situation she was in. And so I asked my sister, well, what about Mother? Because now my mom was still in the home with him and his mother, and Jenny's not there. And she replied, I know. And still to this day, I feel a little bit guilty because I asked her, what about Mother? And I believe she felt a responsibility to our mom, and that's probably one of the main reasons why she went back.
My father was just calling and messaging and leaving all these voicemails. I think it was just so overwhelming.
You have 8 new messages.
That she decided to give it a try again. We walked on the beach, and she just cried, but she put on a brave face. And I still have that picture of her by the ocean, smiling, but there's a sadness, too. I knew she was afraid of what was going to happen when she got there.
She wasn't his wife. She was a possession. And he was not going to let anybody or anything take his possession away from him.
Soon after she got home, maybe a few days or a week, she called me and told me that things were better, things were doing good. He promised her that he would get a control on his spending. They came up with this idea that they were going to bring patients to the home, and then she wouldn't have to go somewhere to work anymore, and that she wouldn't have to work as hard.
Michael's father passed away, and now there was an empty room, and so they decided to go ahead and get a business license and open the home for elderly patients, receiving a monthly check for doing so. They called their home the Heflin Home. And it started with my mom and 2 others. And then when my mom passed away, then she was taking care of 3 elderly folks. In early 2016, my current husband and I took a trip out there for a couple days. I noticed that there were a bunch of cameras up around inside the home. And I asked my sister what they were for. And she had told me that if an elderly person fell, sometimes they might not even know how they fell. And so having a camera system was just good insurance. But they didn't have any downstairs, which is where her and Michael lived, because they never had any elderly down there.
There were 16 cameras around the house, but the 4 main ones pointed into the kitchen, the residential living room, outside, and the storage area that used to be the carport. And that was right outside of my father's garage. My mom's day would start very, very early, sometimes as early as like 4:30 in the morning.
She would start her mornings by getting everybody up, washing them, feeding them. She would take them to doctor's appointments, and she would care for them all the way through the day.
She didn't get very much time to herself at all.
When my sister had 3 residents in the home, she was pulling down about $11,000 a month. And the only expenses they had, of course, was the mortgage and utilities and food. But there was one person in the equation that was going to upset everything that she had worked for.
About 2 months in, he started spending again.
Brand new Bowflex machine, brand new exercise bike. There was all this ham radio equipment. I know that stuff's not cheap. And there was a tremendous gun collection. You can see where the money was being spent, and it wasn't on her.
All the promises that he had made, he went back on. My mom was exhausted from working all the time, and things were worse than ever.
There was one time that we were just walking around Winchester, and then my sister got a phone call, and it was Michael. And he was telling her, "You need to get home. You need to get home right away." We had only been gone for like 20, 30 minutes. And then she looked at me and she said, "I'm sorry, I have to go home." My sister was under his total control. When Jenny came to the realization that things were not going to get better, she decided she was going to leave Michael.
So one day she was delivering Avon, and I think she had let slip that things were not as it seemed at home. And this absolutely shocked her customer, and they really wanted to help her. So they put her in touch with a realtor out in California. She contacted this realtor. She told him what the situation was, that she was trying to get out, trying to escape. And the realtor said that he might have a room for rent in his own home. He was like, "I would love to have a feminine touch around here." He said that he was widowed. And it wasn't so much flirting, but it was a kindness that she really was not used to. So she had a place to go. She started packing. It's not like my father even noticed. He didn't notice. Half her clothes were packed up and mailed to my house.
She finally came to the realization that this is over.
I remember the day she was going to leave very clearly. I couldn't get a hold of my mom. I figured she left her phone downstairs and was caring for a patient. And then I got a call from her. She frantically whispered into the phone, "Melissa, he found out that I'm leaving. I need to leave now. And I was offering to come and get her, but she didn't want to put me in danger. And then she said, "Oh no, he's back. I've got to go." And she hung up.
Frederick County 911.
Ma'am, could you send an ambulance and a police car to 215 Stafford Drive? There's been a shooting.
215 Stafford Drive.
Yes, ma'am.
Who's been shot?
Me and my wife got in a terrible argument. I caught her in an affair, and I just shot her, and I swear to God I didn't mean to do that.
Where is she right now?
Laying in the bathtub. What I'm going to do is this. I've got to put my belt on, the rest of my clothes on, and put my shoes and socks on, and be out front. I'm going to have my hands in the air, tell the officers.
Yeah, I understand. Is she awake?
Yeah, she's a gurgling in there. She's breathing. If the ambulance gets here quick, she might be saved.
Okay, are you... Okay, where's the gun?
I have laid it on the floor. I'm going to be waiting for the police out front.
Okay.
Thank you.
I received a call from my lieutenant. He advised that a female was shot by her husband. Deputies responded to the scene. Mr. Heflin was detained without any issues. They located Mrs. Heflin in a bathtub. She sustained a gunshot wound. She was taken to the Winchester Medical Center, and then from there, they flew her to Inova Hospital.
I was scrolling on the local radio chatter page, 200 block Stafford Drive, man shoots wife. I was dizzy and shaking uncontrollably. I remember running through the hospital and I was just so relieved that she was alive. And it didn't really matter anything else.
Oh my God, he did it. First time in my life, I literally dropped to my knees. And I stood at the end of her bed, and I looked at her, and I knew that she had endured something that no human being should endure. They had to remove her eye. It was beyond repair. They had a procedure the very next morning to try to connect a vein in her arm because it took the brunt of the shotgun blast. Her arm actually saved her life.
She survived so much. There was multiple surgeries on her brain. And she actually started doing a little bit better. So we got very hopeful.
Within 2 or 3 days, I could tell that she knew I was there, and she knew that Melissa was there. She didn't know where she was, but she knew that we were there.
Mr. Heflin, I'm behind you. I don't want to startle you. How are you?
I'm better.
We were conducting an interview with Mr. Heflin at the Frederick County Sheriff's Office.
We run a small nursing home. She had to go upstairs, so I see her phone laying there. God must have made me pick that phone up. I picked the phone up, and there was some man on there she was talking to.
He was on the other end of the phone?
He was texting.
Texting, okay.
Well, what happened was, after I found him on there, I got really mad about it. I said, look, I thought we had things straightened out. Then she came up and told me she'd had multiple affairs. When she went 3 years ago to stay with my daughter, she took a man down there with her. Well, she point blank hit me with all this, and it just broke my heart off. Broke my heart.
He was putting it all on her. All the problems in their relationship was because of her. It was about everything that she did wrong.
Well, my heart's been breaking all day. She should have just left. But no, she wanted to stay a month until her boyfriend could get a house for him down in Florida. Well, we got a fight because she's on the phone with him again. She knew it. She's going to be on the phone with him. That's going to upset me, you know. I grabbed the phone and she was calling him baby and all that stuff. Officer, I went crazy.
So tell me what happened after you lost your cool.
Well, I grabbed the phone from her. She grabbed me around the arm and started twisting my arm. And I started going crazy. I mean, went nuts.
What was she doing?
She tore all of her Christmas present boxes up and destroyed everything and went just completely ape. Oh, yeah.
You grabbed the phone and she went into the bathroom.
Right, that's exactly how it went. She went in the bathroom, pissed off, crying. And I got the shotgun shot through the door. I don't know what possessed me. I'll just shoot through the door now to scare her and she'll straighten up. What was I thinking about? You just go wild and crazy in your mind. I'm sure both of you all have had days where things go nuts and you have trouble controlling yourself.
Everybody, yeah.
I think he was trying to figure out his way of saying he just lost it and it just happened. He was taken to the magistrate and charged with aggravated malicious wounding that night.
The nurses were hopeful, so that gave us hope.
She came out of intensive care because she was doing so well, but the damage with the buckshot in the brain started to bleed.
She got this look on her face, like she was very concerned. I said, "Mom, are you okay?" She said, "Yeah." And then she had a grand mal seizure.
And I remember looking at the head nurse, and her eyes told me what I already knew, that my sister was gone.
At that point, we knew we had a murder investigation.
Oh, believe me, I really didn't mean to do this.
We knew already some of what the defendant was going to testify in his defense.
I pointed the gun at the bathroom door in a rage. The gun went off and it hit her in the head.
She knew that she's going to be on the phone with him. That's going to upset me. I'm sure both of you all have had days where things go nuts and you have trouble controlling yourself.
Everybody, yeah.
That is a classic hot blood defense. He was hoping to reduce his exposure from potentially life in prison for first degree all the way down to 10 years in prison for the manslaughter. And we felt very strongly that that would not be justice. First degree murder was the natural charge in this case. We owed that to the victim, to get justice for our victim. First-degree murder requires premeditation and deliberation, but it doesn't require deliberation for any particular period of time. It can be very quick. You can deliberate in the time it takes to grab a knife and go after someone.
When we reenacted it, it took us approximately 15 seconds to get into the gun safe. And then another several seconds to load the gun and walk to the door of the bathroom. So you're looking at between 25 to 30 seconds before he shot the gun.
That's all time that he could have thought, you know, this is a really bad idea. And that's a lot of premeditation, legally speaking. The timeline of this case, it was an all-day event. There was a great deal of video camera footage within the home during the course of the day. And we could see them moving back and forth throughout the house throughout the day. It had started early in the day. They had argued earlier in the day. And she had had communications with this other gentleman. and he was trying to monitor anything that she was doing on her phone, any chance that he had to get a look at her phone so he could determine whether or not she was texting with this person. He had been focused in on this and riling himself up about this all day long.
Mr. Heflin never gave Miss Heflin any space. It's almost like he kept pushing instead of just separating himself from the situation. He continues to make contact with Miss Heflin. He could have just left her alone.
There was some fantastic work done by our investigators. Investigator Schwartz and the others on the team know that we are going to want to see some ballistics. We're going to want to see the trajectory. That's going to be very important in this case. We know that. The investigators load the buckshot holes with dowel so that we can see the general angle of fire. And we see that it is basically straight through the door, a little bit right to left, and a little bit of a downward angle. Just a little bit. And that's critical in this case. If you think about shotgun ammunition, the cartridges all look the same. It's what's inside that plastic cylinder that's important. Mr. Heflin purposely loaded double-aught buckshot in that shotgun. Double-aught buckshot is a larger size ball, where there's only like 8 or 9 of those balls in there. You're dealing with a very large projectile coming out at an extremely high speed with great force and impact, especially at close range. If you know that your wife is holding that door and you are going to fire through it, you know you're going to strike her. The use of those dowels through the hole showing the trajectory was brilliant police work to show us what his real intent was. We were ready to go to trial. We had more than sufficient evidence to obtain a conviction. We were very confident, but there is always risk. You can never be absolutely certain that a jury will determine your way. And you end up either not getting a conviction at all, or you get manslaughter. His lawyers came to us asking if there was any kind of a plea agreement we could reach, first-degree murder being 20 to life, where the defendant might have some hope of seeing the outside world and not dying in prison. And that's what basically gave us the opportunity to take manslaughter off the table, take first-degree life off the table, just focus on second degree. We know we're dealing with anywhere from 5 to 40 years in prison. So we took that to the family and discussed it with them.
When I heard about the plea deal, I was so angry. He deserved the worst that he could possibly get. This was so cruel. This was evil. But it just kind of made sense, because they said he's going to go away for a long time, and this just ensures that he doesn't walk. I just had to trust them, that they knew what they were doing.
Within the plea deal, he could not appeal the sentence. And so that was a little bit more acceptable.
We decided that we would treat the sentencing hearing like a mini trial of the case.
Yeah, she's a gurgling in there. She's breathing. If the ambulance gets here quick, she might be saved.
We played the 911 tape. We played snippets of his interviews. We did those things just to show that the fact that he'd murdered his wife didn't seem to really affect him emotionally at all.
And I got the shotgun shot through the door.
He was callous, premeditated, and just came after her with the intent to kill her.
It was a good verdict. It was a good sentence. And he's going to be in there for a long time before he's even eligible for parole.
While I would have loved to see him get the electric chair, or a lethal injection or never get out of prison again. I think he got the best that they were able to give us.
If there's any lesson to be learned from this tragedy, Jenny made a blueprint of what road not to go down, and a warning to anyone out there to believe that they are in danger and to escape from that danger and to be able to live their life in freedom. Jenny had signed to be a donor, organ donor, and even in Jenny's death, she still gave life. And 5 people live today because of her. So throughout Jenny's life, she gave and gave and gave. But I know she's at peace now. She's no longer bullied. She is no longer lorded over and told what to do. And I will forever be proud of her for making that decision to finally break free.
The call came in just after dawn, when the fog still clung to the streets like a held breath, when the town had not yet decided whether it was awake or still dreaming, and the voice on the other end of the line was thin, shaking, repeating the same sentence again and again, as if saying it enough times might make it untrue. She's not here. She never misses breakfast. The door was unlocked. The light was on. And that was how it began, not with sirens or gunshots or a scream in the night, but with absence, a gap where a person should have been, a quiet so loud it rattled the walls of a small house on a familiar street in a town where everyone knew everyone else's routines, habits, secrets, or at least they thought they did. By the time the first patrol car rolled in, the fog was lifting, revealing a neat front yard, a porch swept clean the evening before, a coffee mug still warm on the kitchen counter, and a calendar on the wall frozen on a date in late summer 1988, circled in red ink, as if someone had planned to be alive past that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood on the floor, just the unsettling sense that the scene had been paused mid-motion, like a photograph taken a second too late, and the name on everyone's lips was spoken softly, carefully, as though saying it too loudly might summon something worse. Neighbors gathered in clusters at the edge of the yellow tape, robes pulled tight, eyes wide, whispering fragments that never quite formed full sentences. She was quiet. She kept to herself. She walked home every day at 6. She said she felt watched. Did she really say that? Or was that something people only remembered later, when fear rewrote memory into something sharper, more dramatic, more useful? The police asked the same questions over and over, writing down the same answers, checking their watches, already aware of the invisible clock that starts ticking the moment a person goes missing, the hours that matter most slipping away, while everyone pretends they have time. Inside the house, detectives move slowly, methodically, documenting what was there and what wasn't. A purse on the chair, keys on the hook, shoes by the door, everything in its place except the woman who lived among these objects, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, the kind of detail that sticks because it suggests intention, a normal start to a normal day, not a struggle, not a plan to run, not a life about to disappear into a file folder labeled missing person. By noon, the story had spread beyond the street, beyond the town limits, carried by radio bulletins and early afternoon news breaks, the kind that interrupt regular programming with urgent music and grainy photos pulled from driver's licenses and family albums. A smiling face from years earlier, now tasked with representing an entire human being reduced to a headline, a name, an age, a last seen timestamp. The phrase cold case wasn't being used yet, not officially, but it hovered in the background, an unspoken threat, because everyone knew how quickly a warm trail could cool, how easily a living mystery could harden into something untouchable. Search teams combed the nearby woods, Volunteers shoulder to shoulder with officers, boots sinking into damp earth, eyes scanning for anything out of place. A scrap of fabric, a footprint, a sign that would transform panic into purpose. Dogs followed scents that led nowhere, stopping abruptly as if the trail itself had been erased, cut clean, leaving handlers shaking their heads and writing notes they would later read and reread, wondering if they had missed something obvious. A car matching a vague description was reported, then dismissed, then reported again, each sighting more uncertain than the last, each one raising hope only to crush it hours later. As days turned into weeks, the questions multiplied faster than the answers. Why would someone vanish from a locked house? Why leave everything behind? Why here? Why now? And the town began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now double-bolted. Children were walked to school instead of riding their bikes. Curtains closed earlier in the evening. People looked at each other a little longer, searching for something they couldn't quite name. A flicker of guilt, a hint of knowledge, anything that might explain how something like this could happen in a place that prided itself on safety, familiarity, routine. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how thin, interviewing coworkers, ex-partners, old friends, anyone whose name appeared in a notebook or a memory. Some talked too much, others not at all. Alibis were offered, checked, and filed away. One man claimed he had seen her the night before, standing at the edge of the parking lot, waiting for someone, but his timeline didn't quite fit. Another insisted she had mentioned leaving town, starting over, but no one else could confirm it. Each statement added weight to the case, but not direction, like bricks stacked without a blueprint. Then there were the tips that came in late at night, anonymous calls, letters with no return address, whispers of arguments, of a car parked too long near the house, of footsteps heard after midnight. One tip mentioned a scream, another a fight, another a stranger passing through town, and investigators chased them all, because that's what you do when the alternative is admitting you have nothing. Evidence was logged, boxed, labeled, and stored, waiting for the day when technology or time might turn it into something useful. Months passed. The seasons changed. The missing posters faded, corners peeling, faces becoming less familiar to people who passed them every day. The case slowed, then stalled, not officially closed, but quietly set aside, pushed to the back of desks and minds by newer crimes, fresher tragedies, the relentless forward motion of work that doesn't allow for lingering too long on the unsolved. The word cold case finally appeared in internal memos, then in newspaper articles, a clinical term that carried the weight of resignation, of stories that end without an ending. Years went by, and the town learned to live with the absence, folding it into its identity, telling newcomers about the woman who vanished, the house that sat empty for too long, the question that never quite went away. Children grew up hearing the story as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the old place at night. Adults avoided the subject altogether, as if talking about it might bring the fear back to life. The file remained, thick with paper, thin on certainty, a collection of moments frozen in 1988, waiting for someone, anyone, to make sense of them. Inside that file were details that refused to settle, a receipt with a timestamp that didn't match the official timeline, a witness statement that contradicted itself in subtle ways, a piece of physical evidence dismissed as irrelevant because it didn't fit the theory of the time. Back then, investigators did what they could with what they had, unaware that decades later, those same scraps would be examined under a different light, questioned by people who weren't there, who didn't feel the pressure of a town demanding answers, who could afford to slow down and look again. For 36 years, the case slept uneasily, occasionally stirred by anniversaries, by true crime articles, by family members who refused to let the name disappear completely. It became one of those stories that linger at the edge of public consciousness, not quite forgotten, not quite remembered, a ghost of a headline that resurfaces when least expected. And all that time, the truth, whatever it was, remained buried, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when someone would ask the right question, notice the wrong detail, connect the dots that had always been there. Because in small towns, secrets don't vanish. They age. They change shape. They blend into the background until no one thinks to question them anymore. And when a cold case finally begins to crack, it doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic reveal. It starts quietly, with a file pulled from a shelf, a note scribbled in the margin, a second look at something everyone else had already decided didn't matter. That's where this story truly begins, not with the disappearance itself, but with the long shadow it cast, stretching across decades, waiting for the day it would finally point back to the truth. The file came down from the shelf without ceremony, its spine cracked, edges softened by years of handling, the kind of folder that carries its own gravity the moment it hits a desk, because everyone in the room knows what it represents, not just a missing woman, not just a failed investigation, but time itself, years that cannot be returned, questions that learned how to survive unanswered. The detective who opened it wasn't there in 1988, didn't remember the fog, the posters, the fear, and that distance mattered, because familiarity can dull curiosity, while absence sharpens it, forces the eye to linger where others once skimmed. Inside were the usual ghosts of an old cold case, typed reports yellowing at the corners, handwritten notes with outdated phone numbers, Polaroids sealed in plastic, evidence logs listing items that had never found a voice, a strand of hair deemed inconclusive, a partial print smudged beyond usefulness, fibers collected because protocol demanded it, not because anyone believed they would matter. Back then, the investigation had moved fast, driven by urgency, by a community watching every move, demanding progress, demanding reassurance, and in that rush, decisions were made, paths chosen, others quietly abandoned. The new eyes lingered on those abandoned paths, a timeline reconstructed from memory, rather than proof. A witness interview cut short because the subject seemed unreliable. A lead dismissed because it pointed too close to home. Small-town cases carry their own pressure, unspoken but heavy. The understanding that every suspect is also a neighbor, a coworker, a familiar face seen at the grocery store, and that reality shapes investigations in ways reports never admit. No one wrote that down, but it was there, between the lines, in the pauses, in the phrasing, in the careful language used when names overlapped with influence. One detail surfaced again and again, quiet but persistent, the last confirmed sighting, a timestamp built on assumption rather than certainty. The official record stated she was last seen the evening before her disappearance, walking home as usual. A routine turned into fact because it fit the pattern everyone expected. But buried deeper was a conflicting account. A clerk at a late-night convenience store who thought she recognized the woman hours later, tired, distracted, buying something small, something forgettable. At the time, it had been brushed aside. Memory unreliable, lighting poor, stress high. Now, decades later, that dismissal felt less certain. The detective followed that thread, not because it promised answers, but because it had been ignored, and cold cases thrive on neglected details. The store still stood, remodeled, repainted, staffed by people who had never heard of the disappearance. Records were gone, tapes erased long ago, but the layout remained, the distance from the woman's house measurable, walkable, and suddenly the timeline stretched, cracked open just enough to let doubt seep in. If she had been alive hours later than believed, everything shifted. Suspects, motives, opportunity. The entire architecture of the case destabilized. Another inconsistency emerged in the witness statements. Subtle, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Descriptions of a vehicle seen near the house that morning, not the night before. A car idling too long, then gone. In 1988, the focus had been on strangers, outsiders, anyone passing through, but the description didn't match a traveler's car. It matched something ordinary, local, forgettable, the kind of vehicle you wouldn't notice twice unless you were trying to remember later, unless fear had sharpened your recall after the fact. The detective mapped the sightings, plotted times, cross-referenced addresses, slowly building a picture that didn't rely on a single dramatic clue, but on accumulation, small pieces leaning toward each other until they began to suggest a shape. And at the center of that shape was a name that appeared often, but had never lingered long in the spotlight. Someone interviewed early, cleared quickly, filed away under no further interest. The reason for clearance was thin even by the standards of the time, an alibi based on routine, on assumption, on the belief that some people simply didn't fit the profile. Profiles age poorly. What seemed implausible decades ago often looks different through a modern lens, informed by patterns, by cases solved late, by the uncomfortable truth that danger doesn't always announce itself. The suspect, now older, established, had lived quietly for years, the kind of life that discourages scrutiny, the kind that makes reopening questions feel intrusive, unnecessary. But cold cases don't respect comfort. They surface when the timing is right, when technology catches up, when someone decides to look again. The evidence locker held items that had never been tested with modern methods, preserved out of habit rather than hope. Advances in forensic science had transformed the field, turning once useless samples into potential keys. And the detective knew this case had reached that moment. Requests were made, paperwork filed, approvals granted slowly, because revisiting the past costs money, time, political capital. But eventually, the boxes came down, seals broken, contents logged anew. Among them was a piece of clothing recovered near the house weeks after the disappearance, dismissed at the time as unrelated, common, impossible to trace. Now, it was handled differently, carefully, reverently, as if it might finally speak after years of silence. Samples were taken, sent off, entered into databases that didn't exist in 1988. Systems built on the accumulation of millions of lives, millions of fragments, waiting for matches that would never have been possible before. While the lab work moved at its own deliberate pace, the detective turned back to the human side of the case, to the people who had lived with it for decades. Old witnesses were tracked down, some eager to talk, others hesitant, memories blurred by time, but still carrying emotional weight. Fear has a way of preserving certain moments, even as details fade, and some remembered things they had never shared, assumptions they had made, doubts they had swallowed because no one had asked them again. One woman recalled watching from her window that morning, noticing movement she couldn't explain at the time, dismissing it because nothing seemed wrong until it was. Another admitted she had recognized the car, but hadn't wanted to say whose it was. Not back then. Not when the town was already on edge. Not when accusing the wrong person could ruin lives. These were not confessions, not revelations, but they were cracks, small fractures in a story that had seemed solid for too long. The suspect's name resurfaced in conversations with increasing frequency, no longer an afterthought, but a point of convergence, the place where multiple weak signals overlapped. He had known the woman, not intimately, but enough to be unremarkable, enough to move through her orbit without raising alarms. He had lived close by. His routines aligned conveniently with the gaps in the timeline. None of it was proof. All of it was possibility. As the weeks passed, tension built quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but hums beneath the surface, because everyone involved understood the stakes. If the theory was wrong, reopening wounds would serve no one. If it was right, the implications were staggering, not just for the suspect, but for the town, for the investigators who had missed it, for the narrative everyone had accepted for 36 years. Cold cases don't just threaten individuals. They threaten collective memory, the stories communities tell themselves about who they are. Then the call from the lab came. Not dramatic, not celebratory, just a voice delivering information with professional restraint. A partial match. Enough to warrant further testing. Enough to justify a deeper look. The evidence hadn't stayed silent after all. It had waited. And suddenly, the past was no longer distant. It was active, present, pressing forward, demanding attention. The detective sat with that knowledge, aware that from this moment on, nothing about the case would remain theoretical. Lines would be crossed, doors would be knocked on, names would be spoken out loud again. For decades, the disappearance had existed as a question mark, a story without an ending, but now it was shifting, slowly, inexorably, towards something else, something heavier, something that would force the town to confront a truth it had learned to live without. Because cold cases don't stay cold forever. They wait, and when they begin to thaw, they do so unevenly, unpredictably, revealing not just what happened, but everything that allowed it to remain hidden for so long. The knock came in the early afternoon, deliberate, controlled, the kind meant to project authority without aggression. And when the door opened, time folded in on itself, because the man standing there had aged while the suspicion around his name had not. His hair was thinner, his posture slightly stooped, but his eyes were alert, calculating, taking in the badges, the stance, the distance maintained just outside the threshold. He smiled. The reflex of someone used to being seen as harmless, cooperative, the sort of smile that had worked for him before, back when questions were easier to deflect and the past felt safely buried. The detectives didn't mention the cold case at first. They talked about routine things, about updates, about reviewing old files, the language careful, neutral, designed to observe reaction rather than provoke it. He nodded along, offering coffee, commenting on the weather, filling the space with small talk that felt practiced, rehearsed over a lifetime of never being truly challenged. Only when the name was spoken did something shift, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a pause just long enough to register, before the smile returned, thinner now, edged with something harder. He said he remembered her, of course he did, everyone did. It had been a long time, tragic, terrible what happened, or rather what didn't happen, the not knowing, that was the worst part. His story matched the old reports almost word for word, a testament either to consistency or to rehearsal. And as he spoke, the detectives listened not just to the words, but to the rhythm, the places where he sped up, slowed down, the details he volunteered versus those he avoided. When they asked about his routine in 1988, he answered smoothly, the same routine he had cited decades earlier. Work, home, sleep, nothing unusual. Routines are comforting. They're also convenient. The detectives left without pressing further, because pressure comes later, after groundwork, after comparison, after the subject believes the interaction is over. Outside, they compared notes, agreeing on what hadn't been said, on how the answers felt polished, preserved like artifacts themselves. This wasn't a breakthrough. It was a confirmation that the case had entered a new phase, one where every movement mattered. Back at the station, the lab results continued to develop, fragments aligning, probabilities sharpening. The partial match strengthened, narrowed, pointing toward a familial connection that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. In 1988, such a result would have been impossible. Now it carried weight, enough to justify warrants, enough to reopen doors that had been closed for decades. The database didn't care about reputation or time served in the community. It spoke in numbers, likelihoods, margins of error shrinking with each new sample. The detectives requested further testing, broader comparisons, knowing that the process would take time, knowing also that time was a luxury they could no longer afford. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when old stories resurface, and already there were murmurs, familiar names appearing in conversations once again. People who had learned to live with the mystery felt it stirring, a low-level unease, because resolution threatens the comfort of ambiguity. A solved cold case forces accountability, not just for the crime, but for the silence that followed. They began re-examining the suspect's past, not just in relation to the disappearance, but as a whole, looking for patterns that hadn't seemed relevant before. Police reports from neighboring towns, dismissed complaints, incidents written off as misunderstandings, arguments that never escalated far enough to warrant charges. Alone, each meant little. Together, they suggested a shape, a history of proximity to conflict that had never quite crossed the line into consequence. Former co-workers were interviewed, people who remembered him as reliable, quiet, maybe a little intense, but nothing alarming. Others recalled moments that hadn't seemed important at the time, flashes of temper, comments that lingered uncomfortably, a tendency to insert himself into situations that didn't concern him. Memory is a strange thing, reshaped by context, but the detectives were careful, corroborating where possible, separating genuine recollection from retrospective suspicion. The goal wasn't to build a story. It was to uncover one that already existed. Meanwhile, the physical evidence continued its slow transformation from relic to witness. Fibers once dismissed began to align with materials found in the suspect's possession. Common items, yes, but commonality doesn't negate relevance when context narrows. The clothing recovered near the house yielded more information than anyone had expected. Traces preserved despite time, despite exposure, despite the assumption that it was useless. Each result tightened the circle, not conclusively, but convincingly. The suspect was invited back for another conversation, this time under less casual circumstances. He arrived composed, dressed carefully, the image of respectability intact. When the detectives mentioned advances in technology, his jaw tightened, just briefly, before he leaned back, crossing his arms, adopting a posture of mild irritation rather than concern. He questioned the value of reopening old wounds, suggested it might be better to let the past rest, a sentiment often voiced by those who benefit from its silence. They presented him with fragments, not the full picture, just enough to unsettle, to disrupt the narrative he had carried unchallenged for years. His responses became sharper, defensive, his earlier warmth replaced by something colder, more rigid. He accused them of harassment, of chasing ghosts, of wasting resources. The detectives let him talk because anger reveals more than calm ever does. And as he spoke, inconsistencies emerged, small shifts in phrasing, details that no longer lined up perfectly with earlier statements. The interview ended without an arrest, without raised voices, but with a clear change in tone. Outside the room, the detectives understood that they were now visible threats, that the suspect knew the case was no longer dormant. That awareness carries risk. People behave differently when they realize the past is catching up. Surveillance was authorized, discreet but thorough, routines observed, movements logged. There was no dramatic tailing, no sense of a chase, just quiet watching, patience sharpened by decades of waiting. The town felt it too, the subtle change in atmosphere, the way conversations paused when certain names came up, the way people looked twice at familiar faces, wondering what they might have missed all those years ago. The disappearance had always been a shared wound, but now it was reopening, tender, dangerous, forcing people to reconsider their own roles, their own silences. Some felt vindicated for doubts they had never voiced. Others felt defensive, protective of the version of the past they had accepted. As the investigation deepened, the detectives uncovered something else, something that complicated the narrative further. A connection between the suspect and a location that had never been searched thoroughly, land that had changed hands, been developed, paved over. In 1988, it had been dismissed as irrelevant, too far out of the way, too difficult to access. Now, with new context, it demanded attention. Ground-penetrating surveys were requested, permits negotiated, logistics planned, all while maintaining as much secrecy as possible. When the first scans came back, they showed anomalies, disturbances in the soil inconsistent with natural formation. Not proof, but possibility, the kind that quickens the pulse, that shifts a case from intellectual exercise to visceral reality. Excavation was discussed, debated, delayed by bureaucracy, by the need to do everything correctly, because mistakes at this stage could undo years of progress. The suspect, unaware of these developments but increasingly restless, made small changes to his routine, subtle adjustments that stood out precisely because they were unnecessary. He lingered longer at home, avoided certain areas, made calls that ended abruptly when unanswered. Surveillance noted it all, adding it to a growing record of behavior that suggested awareness, not of specific evidence, but of impending consequence. For the detectives, the weight of the case pressed in from all sides, the knowledge that they were close to something irreversible. If the evidence held, if the ground yielded what it threatened to reveal, the cold case that had haunted the town for 36 years would finally cross a threshold. Not into closure, because closure is a myth, but into truth, with all the discomfort that truth brings. And still, nothing was certain. Cold cases are treacherous that way, offering momentum without guarantee, hope without promise. But as part 3 of this long, unbroken story unfolded, the balance had shifted. The past was no longer inert. It was moving, responding, pushing back. And somewhere beneath layers of time, soil, and silence, the answers waited, closer now than they had ever been, ready to change everything. The permits came through quietly, buried in routine approvals, the kind of paperwork that doesn't announce its significance unless you already know what to look for. And by the time the equipment arrived at the edge of the property, the town was already buzzing with rumors that had no single source and no clear shape, just the sense that something old and dangerous was being stirred. The land itself looked ordinary, a stretch of ground altered by years of neglect and partial development, grass uneven, soil compacted by weather and time, giving no indication of what might lie beneath, because places that hold secrets rarely advertise them. The first survey pass was methodical, grid lines mapped, coordinates logged, technicians moving slowly, eyes fixed on screens translating the invisible into shapes and shadows. The machines hummed, steady, indifferent to history, reading disturbances that meant nothing on their own, but everything in context. When the anomalies appeared again, consistent, deliberate, not random, the atmosphere shifted, subtle but unmistakable, professionals exchanging looks they had learned to keep neutral, because experience teaches restraint, especially when hope has burned investigators before. The detectives watched from a distance, hands in pockets, minds racing ahead and pulling themselves back, aware of the thin line between anticipation and assumption. Ground-penetrating data doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell stories either. It suggests, it points, it invites interpretation, and interpretation is where cold cases can falter if caution slips. Still, the shapes were there, rectangular, unnatural, deep enough to avoid casual discovery, shallow enough to be intentional. Someone at some point had disturbed this earth for a reason. Excavation began with care bordering on reverence, each layer removed slowly, documented, photographed, because if this was the place, if this was where the story had been hiding, then every inch mattered. The first shovelfuls revealed nothing but soil, roots, the debris of years, nails, fragments of glass, the detritus of ordinary use. It was easy, in those early hours, to doubt, to wonder if the anomalies were just echoes of past construction, mistakes amplified by expectation. Then the texture of the soil changed. Color shifted, compaction loosened in a way that didn't match the surrounding ground. The technicians paused, signaled, and the work slowed further, hands replacing tools, brushes clearing away earth grain by grain. No one spoke. Even the machines seemed quieter, as if the site itself had registered the significance of what was happening. This was the moment every investigator both anticipates and fears, the point where possibility threatens to become fact. What emerged first was not dramatic, not cinematic, just a fragment, small, pale against the dark soil, easily overlooked if you weren't trained to see it. A bone, human, old, fragile, the kind of discovery that recalibrates an entire case in a heartbeat. For 36 years, the disappearance had been abstract, a question without a body, a mystery that allowed for theories of escape, of accident, of anything that spared the town the certainty of violence. That fragment erased those theories without ceremony. Work stopped. The site was secured. Specialists were called in. Their arrival another quiet escalation, because every added layer of expertise acknowledged that the cold case had crossed into a new category. News traveled fast now, faster than the investigators could control. Whispers turning into headlines, reporters gathering at the perimeter. Cameras pointed at a patch of ground that had meant nothing to anyone a week earlier. The phrase cold case cracked began to circulate, premature, dangerous, but irresistible, because the public craves resolution even before it exists. The suspect felt it before he heard it. A change in the way people looked at him, the sudden weight of attention that had been absent for decades. He avoided the area, not out of innocence, but instinct, the same instinct that had guided him all those years ago. Surveillance noted the change, the tightened routines, the restless pacing, the calls made and deleted, the nights spent awake. Guilt doesn't always confess. Sometimes it just rearranges a life. Back at the lab, the fragment became evidence, cataloged, analyzed, placed within a larger context that was still forming. Age estimates, trauma indicators, timelines reconstructed from decay and deposition, all pointing toward a conclusion that no longer felt hypothetical. This was no longer about what might have happened. It was about how, when, and by whose hand. The cold case had teeth now, and it was biting into the present. The detectives revisited the suspect with this new reality in mind, careful, deliberate, knowing that pressure applied too quickly could shatter the fragile progress they had made. This time, the conversation was different from the start. There was no small talk, no pretense of routine updates. The evidence wasn't laid out in full, but its existence was acknowledged, unmistakable. The suspect listened, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the detectives, as if focusing on something distant might steady him. He denied everything, of course. Denial is the first line of defense, the reflexive response of someone who has lived with a secret long enough to believe it might still protect him. He questioned the validity of the find, suggested misidentification, contamination, coincidence. He spoke of science as if it were a trick, unreliable, flawed, forgetting that it had already begun to dismantle the life he had built on assumptions of permanence. When confronted with the location's connection to him, he hesitated, just long enough, then offered an explanation that was technically plausible but emotionally hollow. He had been there once, years ago, for reasons unrelated, innocent, forgettable. The detectives noted the phrasing, the distance he placed between himself and specifics, the way he avoided naming dates, times, people. It was the language of someone navigating a story rather than recalling a memory. The town reacted in fragments, disbelief colliding with validation, old suspicions resurfacing alongside fierce denial. Some refused to believe that someone so familiar, so woven into the fabric of daily life, could be responsible. Others felt a grim satisfaction, the quiet relief of being right all along, even if they had never said it out loud. The discovery forced everyone to choose a side, whether they wanted to or not, because neutrality dissolves when evidence emerges from the ground. As excavation continued, more fragments appeared, confirming what the first had implied, transforming a single bone into a narrative written in remains and soil. The work was painstaking, emotionally draining, each find a reminder that the disappearance had always been a death, even when no one was ready to admit it. For the investigators, the weight of responsibility grew heavier with each discovery, because now they weren't just solving a case. They were speaking for someone who had been silent for decades. The suspect's legal counsel entered the picture, statements crafted, appearances managed, the machinery of defense activating in response to the shifting balance of power. But behind closed doors, behind the careful language and procedural posturing, there was strain, the kind that seeps through cracks no amount of preparation can seal. Surveillance caught moments of weakness, hands shaking, conversations cut short, a man losing control of a narrative he had dominated for most of his adult life. Still, certainty remained just out of reach. The remains needed identification beyond reasonable doubt. The connection needed to be proven, not inferred. Cold cases demand rigor, because time amplifies every error, and the consequences of a mistake would echo far beyond the courtroom. The detectives knew this. They moved deliberately, resisting the urge to rush toward an ending that felt close enough to touch. As part 4 of this unbroken account drew on, the story had shifted irrevocably. The mystery was no longer about disappearance, but concealment, not about whether a crime had occurred, but how it had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The ground had given up its first secret, but it wasn't finished. Neither was the past. And somewhere between the soil and the silence, the truth continued to surface, piece by piece, dragging an entire town toward a reckoning it could no longer avoid. The identification process moved with the gravity it demanded, slow and exacting, because the difference between belief and proof is measured in details that cannot be rushed. The remains were transferred under tight protocol, every step logged, every hand accounted for, the chain of custody unbroken, as if the integrity of the past depended on it, because, in a way, it did. For decades, the woman had existed only as a photograph, a name, a question. Now science was tasked with giving her back a physical presence, however fragmentary, however late. Forensic anthropologists began their work in silence, examining what the earth had preserved and what it had taken. Age indicators aligned, bone structure matched records. Trauma, once hypothetical, became visible in subtle marks, impressions that spoke without words, telling a story of force, of finality, of a moment when the future collapsed into a single irreversible act. These were not conclusions shared lightly. Each finding was checked, rechecked, measured against standards that left no room for interpretation fueled by expectation. DNA analysis followed, the final bridge between the unknown and the undeniable. Samples were compared against living relatives who had grown old waiting, carrying grief that had never fully formed because there had been no body to mourn. When the call was made, it was handled with care, not as a revelation but as a confirmation, because the family already knew in the way families often do, deep down, long before evidence arrives. The science didn't introduce new pain. It sharpened an old one, gave it edges, made it real. The identification closed one chapter and violently opened another. The missing person case was now a homicide investigation, officially, irrevocably, and with that shift came a different kind of urgency. Statutes, procedures, prosecutorial standards, all activated, narrowing the focus from what happened to who did it, and how to prove it in a court that had not existed when the crime was committed. Time, once the enemy, became a complicated ally, because while memories faded, physical evidence had waited, patient and unchanging. The suspect was brought in again, this time under conditions that reflected the seriousness of the moment. The room was the same, the table, the chairs, the neutral walls designed to strip away distractions, but the balance of power had shifted. He could feel it. It showed in the way he sat, rigid, hands clasped too tightly, eyes darting not with panic but calculation, the look of someone reassessing odds that had once seemed fixed in his favor. The detectives didn't accuse. They laid out facts, carefully chosen, each one a weight added to a scale already tipping. The remains had been identified, the location tied back to him, the fibers matched. The DNA analysis was ongoing but promising. They spoke in calm, even tones, not to provoke, but to create space for the truth to emerge on its own terms. This was not an interrogation meant to break him. It was an invitation to confront inevitability. He responded with anger first, the brittle kind that fractures quickly, accusing the investigators of tunnel vision, of building a case around coincidence and pressure. He demanded lawyers, invoked rights, retreated into procedural defenses that felt rehearsed. But beneath it all was something else, a crack in the composure, moments where his gaze lingered too long on the table, where his breathing shifted when certain details were mentioned. These weren't confessions. They were tells, small signals that the past was no longer contained. Outside the room, the investigation widened again, not away from him, but around him, filling in gaps, fortifying what would soon need to withstand cross-examination and doubt. Financial records were reviewed, movements reconstructed from employment logs, receipts, anything that could anchor him in time and space during the critical window. In 1988, such data would have been sparse. Now, even fragments could be woven into a timeline robust enough to matter. The convenience store sighting resurfaced, newly relevant, its dismissal decades earlier now viewed as a pivotal misstep. The clerk, elderly but lucid, was interviewed again, her memory surprisingly intact where it counted. She described the woman's posture, her expression, details she hadn't known were important at the time. When shown a photo lineup, she hesitated, then pointed, not to the suspect, but to someone else entirely, a man long since dead. A red herring that had once dominated speculation. It complicated the narrative, introduced uncertainty, and forced the investigators to adjust, not retreat. Cold cases rarely resolve in straight lines. They twist, double back, challenge assumptions at every turn. The detectives embraced this, understanding that complexity didn't weaken the case if it was addressed honestly. The sighting suggested the woman had not gone directly from home to her final location. There had been movement, interaction, perhaps coercion that unfolded gradually rather than explosively. This understanding opened new questions, reframed old evidence, and made sense of inconsistencies that had never fit comfortably before. The suspect's reaction to this information was telling. When informed that someone else had been seen with the woman that night, his anger shifted to something closer to relief, a fleeting expression that vanished almost instantly. It was subtle, but it mattered, because innocent people fear implication, not redistribution of blame. The detectives noted it, filed it away. Another piece in a growing mosaic of behavior that spoke louder than any single fact. As media coverage intensified, pressure mounted on all sides. The town found itself under scrutiny, reporters digging into its past, revisiting old articles, questioning former officials, asking why certain leads had been dropped, why certain names had been protected by silence. Defensive narratives emerged, explanations offered, justifications framed as products of their time. But the underlying truth was harder to escape. Something had been missed, and that absence had shaped everything that followed. For the family, the attention was overwhelming. Grief reopened under a spotlight they hadn't asked for. They were careful in their statements, expressing gratitude for renewed effort without assigning blame. Their restraint a quiet contrast to the noise surrounding them. Closure was a word used frequently by outsiders, rarely by those living the reality. What they wanted was not an ending, but acknowledgement, a recognition that the waiting had mattered, that the life lost had not dissolved into abstraction. Behind the scenes, prosecutors evaluated the case with cautious optimism, aware of the risks inherent in bringing charges so long after the fact. Juries are unpredictable. Memories are unreliable. Defense strategies thrive on doubt amplified by time. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight, every inference supported by something tangible. The detectives worked closely with legal teams, stress-testing their own conclusions, inviting criticism, because the worst failure would be a case that collapsed under scrutiny after finally surfacing. The suspect's behavior grew more erratic as days passed. Surveillance documented late-night drives, stops near places connected to the investigation, moments where he seemed to be checking whether the past was still buried or rising behind him. He contacted old acquaintances, conversations clipped, vague, the tone unmistakably anxious. None of it was illegal. All of it was suggestive. It painted a portrait of a man who understood, on some level, that the story he had lived inside for decades was nearing its end. One evening, as the detectives reviewed transcripts and lab updates, a new result arrived, quiet but definitive. The DNA analysis had crossed a threshold, moving from probability to near certainty. It didn't shout. It didn't dramatize. It simply stated a fact that could no longer be ignored. The room fell silent as the implications settled, because this was the moment every cold case reaches, or doesn't. The point where speculation hardens into truth. Still, they waited, not out of hesitation, but discipline. Additional verification was ordered. Independent review requested. The margin for error was narrowed until it effectively disappeared. When the final confirmation came, it did so without fanfare. Another line in a report that carried the weight of 36 years. The evidence now told a coherent story, one that accounted for movement, opportunity, concealment, and silence. It was a story that implicated the suspect not as a possibility, but as a central figure. As part 5 of this long, unbroken narrative settled into place, the investigation stood on the edge of transformation. The woman was no longer missing. She was no longer hypothetical. She was identified, acknowledged, present in the record in a way she had never been before. And the man who had lived comfortably in the shadow of uncertainty now faced a reality that had been assembling quietly around him, piece by piece, waiting for the moment when denial would finally run out of room. The warrant was signed without ceremony, ink drying on paper that carried more weight than it appeared to, because it represented a line crossed, a point of no return after 36 years of waiting. Arrests in cold cases don't come with adrenaline-fueled chases or dramatic confrontations. They arrive quietly, deliberately, at moments chosen for control rather than spectacle. Early morning was selected not for surprise, but for containment, when routines are predictable and resistance is least likely to spiral into chaos. The suspect answered the door in a robe, confusion flickering across his face before recognition settled in. Heavy and unmistakable. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The words were read. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound that echoed far beyond the hallway, reverberating through decades of silence. Outside, neighbors watched from behind curtains, from doorways, from cars idling at the curb, witnessing something they had never fully believed would happen. The past stepping into the present with undeniable force. At the station, the atmosphere was different from every previous interaction. There was no pretense now, no conversational easing into questions. Rights were read again, formally, meticulously, because procedure matters most when the stakes are highest. The suspect sat alone for a long time before the interview began, the isolation itself a kind of pressure, forcing him to sit with the reality he had avoided for most of his adult life. Cold cases don't rush confessions. They let time do what it does best. When the detectives entered, they carried nothing but folders and calm. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. They began not with the crime, but with the years since, asking about his life, his work, his family, building a contrast between the stability he had enjoyed and the instability he had caused. It wasn't cruelty. It was context. It framed imbalance in a way that facts alone sometimes fail to capture. They laid out the timeline again, revised, corrected, supported by evidence that hadn't existed in 1988. The later sighting, the vehicle, the fibers, the land, the remains, each element placed carefully, not as an avalanche, but as a structure, solid and inescapable. The suspect listened, expression guarded, but his defenses were thinning, fatigue eroding the precision of his earlier denials. He interrupted occasionally, objected reflexively, but the rhythm was gone. He was reacting now, not controlling. When the DNA results were introduced, not dramatically, just as another fact, something shifted. His gaze dropped. His breathing changed. This was the evidence he couldn't talk around, couldn't explain away with narrative or indignation. Science doesn't argue. It states. And in that moment, the distance he had maintained from the truth collapsed inward, leaving him exposed in a way he had never experienced. He didn't confess outright. Confessions are rare in cases like this, because admitting guilt would require reliving a moment he had spent a lifetime suppressing. Instead, he offered fragments, partial acknowledgments, statements that skirted responsibility while inching closer to reality. He spoke of arguments, of misunderstandings, of things getting out of hand. Language softened, blurred, as if euphemism could dilute the weight of what he was circling around. The detectives didn't correct him. They let the ambiguity stand, knowing that even deflection can be revealing when measured against evidence. What mattered now wasn't a dramatic admission. It was corroboration. His words, carefully parsed, aligned with details only the perpetrator could know: positioning, timing, the sequence of events that had never been public. Each alignment tightened the case, transforming implication into substantiation. Outside the interview room, preparations were already underway. Prosecutors drafted charges, not hastily, but with deliberate care, selecting language that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the realities of prosecuting it decades later. Murder, concealment of a body, obstruction, each count represented a different facet of harm, not just the act itself, but the sustained effort to erase it from consequence. The town absorbed the news in waves. First disbelief, then a kind of stunned acceptance, followed by a reckoning that touched nearly everyone. People revisited memories, re-examined interactions, questioned their own instincts. The suspect's arrest didn't just remove a threat. It destabilized a shared narrative, forcing residents to confront the uncomfortable truth that safety can coexist with violence. That familiarity is not immunity. For the family, the arrest brought a complex mixture of relief and grief, emotions colliding rather than resolving. Justice was moving, finally, but it couldn't restore what had been taken, couldn't rewind time to a morning when a coffee mug was still warm on a counter. They attended the arraignment quietly, faces composed, carrying a weight that no legal proceeding could fully address. In court, the suspect appeared diminished, stripped of the everyday anonymity that had protected him for decades. His name was spoken in full, publicly, attached irrevocably to the crime. He pleaded not guilty, as expected, the words procedural rather than defiant. The judge set dates. The process advanced. Cold cases don't end with arrests. They transform into something else, something equally demanding, equally unforgiving. Behind the scenes, the detectives continued their work, anticipating defense strategies, reinforcing every link in the chain. They revisited the excavation site, ensuring documentation was exhaustive. They re-interviewed witnesses, locking in statements before time could distort them further. Every action was guided by the knowledge that the case would be scrutinized intensely, not just by a jury, but by history itself. As Part 6 of this unfolding account settled, the investigation had crossed from pursuit into accountability. The secret that had shaped a town for 36 years was no longer a rumor or a suspicion. It was a matter of record, moving inexorably through a system designed to weigh truth against doubt. The silence that had protected the perpetrator was broken, replaced by a process that demanded answers, even if those answers came too late to undo the damage. And still, the story wasn't finished. Trials loom, defenses form, truth faces its final test. Cold cases may crack with an arrest, but their impact continues to ripple outward, challenging not just those directly involved, but everyone who lived alongside a lie, without knowing it was there. The pretrial phase unfolded like a slow tightening vice, pressure applied evenly, relentlessly, in motions and countermotions that transformed the raw shock of the arrest into something procedural, clinical, and no less devastating for it. Courtrooms are designed to drain emotion from events, to flatten them into arguments and exhibits, but this case resisted that flattening because every filing dragged history back into the present. Every hearing reopened questions the town had spent decades avoiding. Defense attorneys moved quickly, aggressively, attacking the foundations before the structure could fully set. They challenged the excavation, the chain of custody, the reliability of technology that did not exist in 1988. They spoke of contamination, of memory distortion, of confirmation bias infecting an investigation eager for resolution. These arguments weren't frivolous. They were expected. Cold cases live or die on the strength of their weakest link, and the defense knew exactly where to probe. The prosecution responded with patience rather than outrage, laying out protocols, expert testimony, meticulous documentation that traced each piece of evidence from past to present without interruption. They explained how preservation, once accidental, had become intentional, how standards had evolved without invalidating what came before. Science had not rewritten the past, they argued. It had illuminated it. The judge listened, impassive, weighing not emotion but admissibility, because truth in court must first survive rules. Witness lists expanded and contracted as strategies shifted. Some names were struck, deemed too fragile under cross-examination. Others were elevated, their testimony sharpened, contextualized. The elderly convenience store clerk became a focal point, her memory both a strength and a vulnerability. Experts were prepared to explain how certain details endure while others fade, how trauma imprints selectively, not randomly. The goal was not to portray memory as infallible, but as consistent where it mattered. The defense sought to introduce alternative theories, ghosts of old suspects resurrected to muddy the waters. They argued that proximity was not proof, that coincidence could masquerade as pattern, that a town hungry for closure might accept answers too readily. The prosecution welcomed these arguments, not because they weakened the case, but because they forced it to be stronger. Every alternative had been examined, dismissed not by assumption, but by evidence that failed to support it. Outside the courtroom, the town fractured along invisible lines. Some rallied behind the accused, citing years of normalcy, of neighborly interactions that seemed incompatible with violence. Others found themselves reinterpreting those same interactions through a darker lens, moments once dismissed, now heavy with implication. Social gatherings thinned, conversations became careful. Silence, once a shared coping mechanism, returned in a different form, edged with suspicion rather than denial. Media coverage intensified, timelines reduced to sound bites, complexity flattened into narratives that demanded heroes and villains. The phrase "killer revealed after 36 years" dominated headlines, even as the legal process cautioned against certainty before verdict. The detectives watched this from a distance, frustrated but resigned, knowing that public opinion moves faster than courts, and often in directions evidence alone cannot correct. Behind closed doors, preparations continued with near-obsessive attention to detail. Exhibits were tested, retested. Demonstratives were refined to explain not just what was found, but why it mattered. The excavation footage was reviewed frame by frame, ensuring nothing could be mischaracterized. Experts rehearsed testimony designed not to overwhelm, but to clarify, translating decades of advancement into language a jury could grasp without distortion. The suspect's demeanor shifted again as the reality of trial approached. The brittle anger of arrest gave way to a hollow defensiveness, a man conserving energy, focusing inward. Jail records noted changes in routine, sleep patterns disrupted, meals left untouched. He spoke less during meetings with counsel, listening more, absorbing the weight of a case that no longer revolved around what might be proven, but what likely would be. For the family, the waiting took on a new shape. They attended hearings sporadically, choosing distance over daily exposure, protecting themselves from the grinding repetition of details they'd already lived through in imagination. When they did appear, they were composed, dignified, a presence that reminded everyone in the room that this was not an abstract exercise in law, but a reckoning with a life interrupted and a grief prolonged. As jury selection neared, the challenge became finding 12 people untouched by the case, unshaped by decades of rumor and recent headlines. Questionnaires probed exposure, bias, emotional thresholds. Potential jurors spoke candidly about growing up with the story, about parents who warned them, about their own theories formed long before evidence surfaced. Each admission underscored the difficulty ahead. This was not just a trial of a man. It was a trial of a collective memory. The judge issued instructions aimed at containment, limiting commentary, emphasizing presumption of innocence, erecting barriers against influence that could never be fully sealed. Cold cases carry an inherent imbalance, the weight of time pressing toward resolution, the human desire to finally close a chapter. The court's role was to resist that pressure, to demand proof rather than relief. As Part 7 of this continuous account pressed forward, the story entered its most precarious phase. The investigation had done its work. The arrest had been made. The evidence assembled. Now, everything hinged on translation, on whether decades of silence, fragments, and persistence could be rendered convincingly into a language 12 strangers would accept beyond reasonable doubt. The past had been unearthed. The present had responded. What remained was judgment, slow, deliberate, and unforgiving. In the space between accusation and verdict, the truth stood exposed, vulnerable to scrutiny, awaiting a decision that would not just define guilt or innocence, but determine how a town, and those who lived within its long shadow, would finally understand what had happened all those years ago. The trial began without drama, no gasps, no raised voices, just the quiet ritual of a system built to absorb tragedy and render it into order. Opening statements framed the past in competing shapes, the prosecution outlining a story of proximity, opportunity, and concealment, the defense cautioning against the seduction of hindsight, reminding the jury that time corrodes certainty as easily as it preserves fragments. Both sides spoke calmly, deliberately, because urgency had no place here. This was about endurance. The first witnesses established the ground truth, the geography of a town that once felt impermeable to violence. Streets, routines, distances measured not in miles but minutes. The morning of the disappearance was reconstructed piece by piece, not to overwhelm, but to orient, to give the jury a map against which all later claims would be tested. Photographs appeared on screens, grainy and dated, yet stubbornly present, pulling 1988 into a room that smelled faintly of polished wood and recycled air. Then the science took the stand. Experts spoke in careful language, defining terms, explaining margins of error, dismantling misconceptions before they could harden into doubt. Ground-penetrating anomalies were translated into comprehensible shapes. Soil stratification became a timeline. The recovery process was shown, not sensationalized, but precise, respectful, the deliberate uncovering of something hidden too long. When the bone fragment was introduced, there was a shift in the room, subtle but universal, a collective intake of breath that no instruction could fully contain. The defense cross-examined with rigor, probing for contamination, for gaps, for assumptions disguised as conclusions. They questioned preservation methods from an era less exacting than the present, raised hypotheticals designed to loosen confidence. The experts answered steadily, conceding limits where they existed, refusing to overreach. Credibility, not certainty, was the goal. Cold cases don't offer perfection. They offer convergence. The DNA testimony followed, clinical and devastating in its restraint. Probabilities were stated, not dramatized. Likelihood ratios spoke louder than rhetoric. The match was framed not as destiny, but as data, one more pillar supporting a structure built over years. When the defense suggested coincidence, the expert nodded, acknowledged it as a theoretical possibility, then quantified its improbability until coincidence sounded less like doubt and more like denial. Witnesses from the town took the stand next, ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. The neighbor who remembered the car, the woman who watched from her window. Each account was imperfect, shaped by time, but consistent in ways that mattered. Cross-examination tested memory, pressed on inconsistencies, highlighted uncertainty. Some witnesses faltered. Others surprised themselves with clarity. The jury watched closely, learning not just what they said, but how they said it. The difference between reconstruction and recollection. The convenience store clerk's testimony was handled with particular care. She spoke slowly, thoughtfully, acknowledging what she didn't know as readily as what she did. When she described the woman's posture, her distraction, the sense that something was wrong without knowing why, the courtroom stilled. This wasn't identification in the cinematic sense. It was recognition, partial and human, the kind that lingers long after facts blur. The defense pressed hard, suggesting suggestion, contamination by media, the fallibility of decades-old memory. She held her ground, not by insisting, but by remaining consistent. When the defendant's statements were introduced, recorded interviews played in clip segments, pauses and hesitations as revealing as words. Jurors leaned forward, listening for tone, for shifts, for the places where language softened and responsibility blurred. The prosecution didn't claim confession. They didn't need to. They argued alignment, the way certain details surfaced unprompted, the way knowledge appeared where ignorance would be expected. The defense countered with explanations of stress, of misunderstanding, of the human tendency to fill gaps under pressure. Throughout it all, the defendant sat still, expression carefully neutral, occasionally conferring with counsel, eyes rarely lifting toward the jury. He had become an object of study rather than a presence, a person reduced to what could be proven about him. That transformation is one of the quiet violences of trial, necessary, impersonal, and absolute. As days passed, the case accumulated weight rather than momentum. Each witness added a layer, each exhibit a thread, the picture emerging slowly, resisting simplification. Jurors took notes, asked questions through the judge, tested the narrative against their own internal standards. This was not a story told once. It was a structure assembled plank by plank. Closing arguments arrived without flourish. The prosecution spoke of patience, of persistence, of evidence that waited when people could not. They asked the jury to consider not any single piece, but the way the pieces leaned toward one another, mutually reinforcing. The defense warned against the danger of wanting an answer too badly, of mistaking convergence for certainty. They urged restraint, reminding the jury that doubt, once established, must be honored. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into a charged quiet, the kind that hums beneath the surface, because everyone understands that from this point forward, the story belongs to 12 people in a closed room. Hours passed, then more. Questions were sent back, clarifications requested, testimony replayed. The machinery of justice turned slowly, grinding years into hours. Outside, the town waited again, a posture it knew too well. Conversations were hushed. Speculation bloomed and withered in equal measure. For some, the trial had already answered what they needed answered. For others, uncertainty persisted, the fear of finality as strong as the desire for it. Cold cases teach communities how to wait. They rarely teach them how to end. As Part 8 of this unbroken narrative settled into place, the outcome remained suspended, balanced between proof and doubt, memory and measurement. The past had been spoken aloud, examined under light that did not exist when the crime was committed. Now it rested in the hands of those tasked with judgment, the final barrier between a story long told and a truth finally rendered official, whatever form that truth might take. The verdict did not come quickly, and in the waiting there was a strange familiarity, a return to the posture the town had learned decades ago, suspended between knowing and not knowing, between the comfort of routine and the terror of resolution. Inside the jury room, time stretched and compressed, hours folding in on themselves as evidence was revisited, notes compared, doubts voiced and tested. This was not a room hungry for drama. It was a room weighed down by responsibility, aware that whatever decision emerged would harden into history. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the air shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Bodies leaning forward as if proximity could influence outcome. The defendant stood, hands clasped, expression unreadable, a practiced stillness that had carried him through decades of anonymity and now served as armor. The foreperson's voice was steady, rehearsed, each word measured, because this was not just an answer. It was an ending to a question that had outlived marriages, careers, entire phases of life. Guilty. The word landed without echo, without flourish, final in its simplicity. For a moment, no one moved, as if sound itself needed time to catch up. Then reactions fractured across the room. The family's quiet exhale, grief and relief colliding into something that looked like composure but felt like survival. The defendant closed his eyes, not in shock, but in recognition, the look of someone who had always known this outcome existed, even if he believed he could outrun it. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them with instructions that acknowledged the weight they carried beyond the courtroom doors. Sentencing was scheduled, procedure resumed, the system advancing as it always does, indifferent to the emotional wreckage left behind. The defendant was led away, no longer a neighbor, no longer a fixture of daily life, but a convicted murderer, his name permanently affixed to a crime that had once been whispered and was now spoken aloud. Outside, microphones waited, cameras pointed, reporters ready to condense decades into seconds. Soundbites replaced nuance, certainty replacing the careful language of court. Justice after 36 years, they said, as if justice were a moment rather than a process, as if the verdict could retroactively heal what had been broken. The detectives watched from the edge of the crowd, not celebrating, not mourning, simply absorbing the end of a pursuit that had defined years of their lives. Sentencing arrived weeks later, a formality that still carried weight. Impact statements were read, voices steady despite the tremor beneath them, words chosen not for revenge, but for truth. The family spoke of absence, of birthdays marked by silence, of a life paused and then erased. They did not ask for suffering. They asked for acknowledgement. The defendant listened, expression fixed, absorbing words he could no longer deflect or deny. The sentence was long, measured in years that would exceed the remainder of his life, the court acknowledging both the crime and the time stolen. There was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, just a nod, almost imperceptible, the acceptance of inevitability. Prison doors closed behind him not as punishment alone, but as punctuation, the end of a sentence written in 1988 and completed decades later. For the town, the aftermath was complicated. Some felt lighter, as if a pressure they hadn't known how to name had finally lifted. Others felt exposed, forced to confront how easily normalcy can coexist with horror. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, then more openly. Stories retold with new context, old memories reframed. The house where it had begun remained, unremarkable, a reminder that places do not change simply because truth has passed through them. The detectives returned to their desks, files closed, shelves rearranged, the physical markers of the case reduced to archived boxes and digital records. They were praised, interviewed, credited with perseverance, but privately they understood the limits of their victory. Solving a cold case does not restore the dead. It does not erase decades of uncertainty. It answers a question and reveals how much damage the waiting itself can do. In the years that followed, the case entered the canon of resolved mysteries, cited in conferences, referenced in training, proof of what patience and technology can achieve. But for those who lived it, it remained something else entirely, a wound that had scarred rather than healed, a reminder that time does not soften all edges. Sometimes it sharpens them. The woman at the center of it all was finally laid to rest properly, her name engraved not as a missing person, but as someone known, acknowledged, mourned. The ceremony was small, private, deliberate, an act of reclaiming dignity rather than closure. There were no speeches about endings, only quiet recognition that the truth, once buried, had been brought into the light. And yet, even with a verdict, even with a sentence, something lingered. Cold cases, once cracked, leave behind an echo, a residual hum of questions about how it took so long, about what was missed, about who might have spoken sooner. The town learned to live with that echo, just as it had learned to live with the silence before it. As part 9 of this long, unbroken voice drew toward its final movements, the story no longer belonged to investigators or courts. It belonged to memory, to the way communities carry their past forward, altered but intact. Justice had arrived, late but undeniable, and in its wake it left not peace, but understanding, the hardest and most necessary outcome of all. Years passed after the sentence, and time did what it always does in places like this. It folded the extraordinary back into the ordinary, turned headlines into footnotes, turned shock into something quieter and harder to define. New families moved in, old ones moved away. Children who had not been born in 1988 grew up hearing fragments of the story without fully understanding its weight. A cautionary tale half remembered, half disbelieved, the kind of local history that sounds exaggerated until you realize every detail is documented, every horror preserved in ink and tape. The convicted man aged quickly behind concrete walls, stripped of the camouflage of normal life, reduced to a number, a routine, a narrow horizon measured in counts and meals. There were no interviews, no attempts to explain himself, no dramatic confessions offered to the world. Silence became his final strategy, a withdrawal so complete it felt deliberate, as if even now he believed withholding words was a form of control. Psychologists studied his file, criminologists debated motive, but the man himself remained opaque, a void where clarity should have been. For the investigators, retirement arrived one by one, badges turned in, desks emptied, careers summarized in plaques and speeches that always circled back to the case. The one everyone remembered. They nodded politely during praise, accepted the accolades, but in quieter moments they admitted the truth to each other, that solving the case had not brought the satisfaction they had imagined in younger years. It had brought answers, yes, but also regret, an awareness of every night the victim had remained nameless, every year the killer had lived freely, blending into the fabric of the town. The evidence that finally cracked the cold case became a point of fixation in legal circles, analyzed for its implications, its timing, its reliability. DNA, once science fiction, had rewritten the rules, reached backward through time, and touched a moment thought lost forever. But that realization carried its own discomfort, the understanding that truth had been waiting all along. Trapped in samples no one knew how to read, progress had not changed the past. It had only illuminated it. The victim's family learned to exist in a new emotional geography, one where the question mark had been replaced by a period, heavy and final. They spoke openly now, not because it was easy, but because silence no longer served a purpose. They told the story correctly, carefully, resisting sensationalism, insisting on humanity over spectacle. In doing so, they reclaimed something that had been taken from them, not the life that was lost, but the narrative that had once been controlled by rumor and fear. The town council debated memorials, plaques, gestures of acknowledgement that might signal collective accountability. Some argued it was better to move on, to avoid reopening wounds. Others insisted that forgetting was its own kind of failure. In the end, they chose something modest, a small marker, a date, a name. Nothing dramatic, just a recognition that what happened here mattered, that ignoring it would not make it disappear. True crime documentaries arrived inevitably, crews chasing the aesthetic of darkness, the allure of small-town secrets. They filmed empty streets at dusk, doorways lit from within, interviews staged to suggest menace where there was mostly memory. Viewers consumed the story in episodes, digestible and distant, unaware of how strange it felt for residents to see their lives edited into suspense. The case had been solved, but now it belonged to the world, reframed, repackaged, stripped of its intimacy. And still, beneath the layers of analysis and retelling, the core remained unsettlingly simple. A woman vanished, a community adapted, a man hid in plain sight. Decades passed. Truth emerged too late to prevent anything, just in time to explain everything. That sequence resisted comfort. It offered no moral symmetry, no clean resolution, only the blunt acknowledgement that evil does not always announce itself, and justice does not always arrive when it is needed. Late at night, in houses that stood through all of it, people sometimes lay awake replaying the timeline, wondering how close they had come, how easily they might have noticed something and didn't. These thoughts were rarely spoken aloud, but they lingered, an undercurrent of unease that survived even the verdict. Knowing who did it did not erase the vulnerability the case had exposed. As the years continued to stack upon one another, the cold case lost its chill in public discourse, categorized now as solved, resolved, complete. But labels are administrative, not emotional. For those connected to it, the case remained active in quieter ways, surfacing in memories, in anniversaries, in moments of unprovoked sadness. Closure, they learned, is not a door that closes. It is a room you learn to stand in without collapsing. And so the story pressed forward, not toward peace, but toward a deeper understanding of what had been taken and what had been left behind. A reminder that even when a killer is revealed, the true impact of a crime continues to unfold. Long after the courtroom empties, long after the cameras shut off, long after the world decides it has moved on, there is a moment, long after the verdict and the sentence and the last interview fades from rotation, when the story stops being something people actively talk about and becomes something they carry instead, a weight redistributed across memory rather than newsprint, and in that quiet, the true shape of the case finally reveals itself. It is no longer about the killer's name or the evidence that exposed him, no longer about procedure or precedent. It is about endurance, about what it means for a community to live for decades alongside an unanswered question and then learn, too late, that the answer is closer than anyone wanted to believe. The town continues to wake up the same way it always has. Coffee poured, doors unlocked, routines resumed, but there is a subtle shift, a new awareness threading through the ordinary. People notice small things now, pauses in conversation, inconsistencies in stories, the way familiarity can dull suspicion until it disappears entirely. The case taught them that danger does not always arrive loudly, that sometimes it settles in quietly, learns the rhythms of a place, and waits. The victim's name is spoken differently now, not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a person anchored in time, her life restored to specificity. Friends remember her laugh, the way she walked too fast when excited, the plans she talked about as if the future were guaranteed. These details, once overshadowed by speculation, finally have space to exist. Remembering her correctly becomes an act of resistance against the years when she was reduced to a file number, a question mark, a shadow. The man who killed her recedes into abstraction, his face aging in photographs no one studies closely anymore. Prison contains him, but it does not contain the questions his life raises. How many dinners did he attend while the case went cold? How many conversations did he have about safety, about fear, about justice? How often did he hear her name and feel nothing? These questions do not demand answers so much as they demand acknowledgement, a recognition of how easily the extraordinary can hide inside the ordinary. Investigators who once chased the truth now watch from a distance as new cases rise and fall, as technology advances again, promising answers to questions not yet asked. They understand now that cold cases are not frozen in time. They are preserved, waiting for the moment when science, patience, and chance intersect. But they also understand the cost of waiting, the lives lived in limbo, the damage done by not knowing. Progress, they've learned, is bittersweet. The archives hold the physical remains of the investigation, boxes labeled, evidence sealed, reports digitized and backed up, the case preserved against forgetting. Yet the most important record is not stored on a shelf. It lives in the collective consciousness of the town, in the way people teach their children about trust, about vigilance, about the thin line between comfort and complacency. The case reshaped those lessons permanently. Occasionally, a visitor asks about it, drawn by podcasts or documentaries, expecting something theatrical, something dark and thrilling. They are often surprised by the restraint of the answers they receive. The residents do not perform the story anymore. They do not sensationalize it. They speak plainly, carefully, as if handling something fragile. The story is no longer entertainment to them. It is inheritance. Time continues to move forward, indifferent to resolution. New tragedies occur elsewhere. New mysteries capture attention, and the world's focus shifts as it always does. But this case, once a cold case and now a solved one, leaves behind a colder truth, that justice, even when achieved, cannot rewind the clock. It can only mark where the clock should have stopped. On certain anniversaries, flowers appear quietly at the memorial, placed without ceremony, without announcement. No crowds gather. No speeches are made. The gesture is small, deliberate, a reminder that remembrance does not require an audience. It requires intention. The flowers wilt and are replaced, the cycle repeating, an ongoing acknowledgement that some losses never fully integrate into the past. The town lives with a dual reality now, pride in the perseverance that brought the truth to light, and discomfort in knowing how long it took. These feelings coexist, unresolved, much like the case once did. There is no final emotion that cancels out the others. There is only balance, uneasy and necessary. And in the quiet hours, when the streets are empty and the lights burn low, the story feels closest, not as fear, but as awareness. The knowledge that answers can come late, that evil can be patient, that truth can survive decades of silence. The cold case may be cracked, the killer revealed, but the echo remains, a low hum beneath daily life, reminding everyone who hears it that some stories never truly end. They simply stop being told out loud. Long after the flowers stop appearing and the memorial fades into the background of daily errands, the case continues its quiet work, shaping instincts rather than conversations, teaching lessons without announcing them. Parents pause a second longer before waving their children off. Neighbors listen more carefully, not out of paranoia, but out of an earned attentiveness, an understanding that awareness is not fear. It is respect for how fragile normalcy can be. The files remain closed, officially finished, yet they are never truly dormant. They resurface in training rooms, in late-night debates among detectives who wonder which current mystery will one day be labeled a cold case, which box will wait decades for the right hand to open it. The solved case becomes a warning and a promise at the same time. Proof that persistence matters, and proof that persistence has limits measured in human cost. Technology continues to advance, algorithms growing sharper, databases expanding, science pushing deeper into the past, pulling truths forward whether people are ready or not. With each breakthrough, the solved case feels both triumphant and accusatory, a reminder that justice is often a matter of timing, and timing is rarely fair. The knowledge that answers could arrive sooner in the future does not comfort those who waited too long in the past. The victim's family moves through life carrying a different kind of absence now. Not the hollow uncertainty of not knowing, but the solid weight of knowing too much. They do not seek the spotlight, do not correct every misstatement or dramatized retelling. They choose their moments carefully, speaking when accuracy matters, when humanity risks being erased by narrative convenience. In those moments, they are not advocates or symbols. They are witnesses. The man responsible becomes a footnote in his own story, his identity shrinking to the crime he committed, his years beyond it rendered irrelevant. This is not vengeance. It is consequence. History does not owe him complexity. It owes him accuracy, and that accuracy is sufficient. He fades, not into forgiveness, but into fact. In the town, life continues in layers. The present lay gently over the past, never fully obscuring it. New buildings rise, old ones are renovated, streets are repaved, yet certain corners retain a quiet gravity, places where memory settles whether people acknowledge it or not. These are not landmarks marked on maps. They are felt, not seen. The case becomes part of the town's internal mythology, not exaggerated, not embellished, but distilled into something instructive. It is told not to frighten, but to ground, not as a spectacle, but as context. A reminder that vigilance is not suspicion, that community is not immunity, that trust requires maintenance. For those who work the case, who carried it home night after night, the ending arrives in fragments. A moment of relief here, a flash of regret there, pride tempered by the awareness of what could not be saved. They learn that resolution is not a single emotion, but a spectrum, and that living with that spectrum is the real work. As years turn into decades, the case slips further into the past, referenced less often, studied less intensely, its shocks softened by time, yet its influence persists in subtle ways, shaping policy, informing procedure, guiding decisions made quietly behind desks and doors. The case solved one mystery and prevented others from being forgotten. And still, in the deepest quiet, when memory surfaces uninvited, the story asserts its final truth, that justice is not an event, but a process that stretches across lifetimes, that answers can arrive late and still matter, that a cold case, once cracked, does not warn the past, but it does illuminate it. The voice that tells the story does not end with certainty or comfort. It ends with recognition. Recognition of loss. Recognition of perseverance. Recognition that some truths change everything when they emerge, and others simply confirm what time has already taught. The case is over. The echo is not,